chat open. 7:01 p.m. on the East Coast of New York, and welcome everyone to StarBurst, the Speculative Sundays Poetry Readings for Women's History Month. Sunday, March 8th, 15th, where am I? We're live on Facebook via Zoom. I am Akua Leslie Hope, speaking to you from the ancestral land of the Onondaga, also known as the Seneca, keepers of the Western Door in the southern Finger Lakes region of New York State. I pay homage to the Seneca, past, present, and future, and to my own ancestors by whose grace I exist and am sustained. This reading is being recorded, so if you've got concerns, please turn your camera off. Otherwise, you're going to be recorded. This series was made possible in part by poets and writers with public funds from the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the New York State Legislature. Thank you to all those who support the arts. Inaugurated in September 2020, the series seeks to remediate the paucity of presentations of speculative poetry by its living creators. Now in its 7th year, the Speculative Sundays Poetry Reading Series has presented 87 poet readings. Speculative poetry, ancient of days, older than the flood, the poetry of possibilities, centers the imagined to real. The first recorded human literature was speculative verse. Gilgamesh, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Iliad and Odyssey, and Beowulf are ancient exemplars. Speculative poetry includes alternate history, astropoetry, cryptids, cyberpunk, dystopian, fabulism, fairytales, fantasy, folklore, futurism, horror, magic, monsters, mythology, occult, paranormal, robots, science fiction, shifters, slipstream, solar punk, solar funk, space opera, superheroes, supernatural, sword and sorcery, sword and soul, steampunk, steampunk, time travel, post-apocalyptic, and weird. It takes all poetic forms plus one of its own called scifaiku. From nursery rhymes to Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, from Puff the Magic Dragon to Zombie Jamboree, we've all recited and sung speculative poetry. You can find the series recordings on YouTube, and you can find lists of past readers at speculativepoetry.com. Now, let me say one more thing about how beautifully the speculative connects with women's history. Women in the speculative I thought of as Christina Rossetti's Goblin Market and Emily Dickinson's Witch and Ghost poems, both writing before the 20th century. But then I was reminded that humanity's first known author is Enheduanna, high priestess of Ur and daughter of Sargon, the first known author in history. She wrote hymns to the goddess Inanna and other deities, offering an early look into individual consciousness over 4,000 years ago. Let me introduce our poet for this evening, Marie Brennan, a former anthropologist and folklorist who shamelessly, she says, leans on her academic fields for inspiration. She's the author of more than 20 novels, nearly 100 short stories, and over a dozen poems. Her poem, A War of Words, won the Hugo Award, the first poetry Hugo Award. Yes. And her novels and game writing have been nominated for the Nebula and World Fantasy Awards. As half of M.A. Carrick, she has also written the Rook and Rose epic fantasy trilogy and the upcoming Sea Beyond duology. Welcome, Marie.
Thank you. Yeah, it amuses me every time I post my bio into something and I'm like novels and all these short stories and a number of poems. Um, I still think of myself as being very new to poetry. I wrote what I consider to be my first poem, and I'll talk about that more in a bit, in October of 2021. So we're looking at less than 5 years that I've been doing this, which, it's still multiple years, but I've been writing novels and short stories for more like 25 years, so this feels very much like the Johnny come lately part of my work. Um, and I was telling Akuo beforehand that one of the effects of this is going to be that in this reading, I will be doing my entire published body of work that is not still in its period of exclusivity, because that's not a lot of poems. I have only been publishing them for a little bit, and I also tend not to write really long poems. You'll discover that most of these are on the shorter side. So yeah, we can get through the entire thing in the time that I have here. I'm going to start off with my first published poem. It seems like the right place to begin. This one was published in Fantasy Magazine in August of 2023, so 2.5 years ago. Like that's the timeline we're working on here. It is called Damnatio Memoriae, A History of the Past That Used to Be. Their stories filled encyclopedias. Matched ranks on the shelf, leather-bound, volume after volume, cover to cover, packed with their achievements, their failings, their tales. Wives to their husbands, daughters to their fathers, mothers to their sons, and to their own wives and mothers and daughters too. Partnerships for the ages, mentorships of legend, and more. Themselves on their own, not captive in the strands of relations net. A history of men and women together, hand in hand, equal-footed. We don't even know his name. There's irony and justice in that. From the pages of the past, he erased their names. Margaret here, or Susan, or Anne. Jiao No there, or Xiang Yu, or Lan. Leaving behind a great man's unnamed daughter, a wife from the family Liu. A battle lost that she did not command. Plays unwritten, discoveries delayed. Untold thousands, their deeds undone, their selves reduced to footnotes. In names, there is power. In namelessness, silence. A history rewritten, lost. So that one came about because I was reading a book about a 18th century Chinese writer named Pu Songling, and it mentions in passing that he married a wife from the family Liu. And it just hit me because I have read so much of history. I see this all over the place in like English history, Roman history, all the different corners that I like to read in. All of these cases where we don't know the names of the women. We just know that this guy had a wife. He had a mother from such and such family, but we don't know her name. He had a daughter. She never gets named. Or, maybe just the name and nothing else about them. History is full of nameless women. And damnatio memoriae is a Latin phrase from a Roman practice of basically obliterating the record of somebody, your damnation of their memory. So that was the concept that started me down the line here of what if somebody had basically committed damnatio memoriae upon women en masse, and that rewrote history. So, super cheerful poem to begin with. Now, I said that I've only been writing poetry since October of 2021. The next one that I'm going to read, I consider to be my first poem, but that has like an asterisk on it. Um, I had written some poetry before this. I had to do it in elementary school for an assignment. I'm sure many of us did. I actually found that book when my parents moved out of their house, so I have a record of wee baby me's poems. They're not good. Um, but I'd also written some for like role-playing games that I'd played in, or I had a couple of stories where the story needed a poem, and so I wrote something. I'd even at one point in grad school taken a very bad run at a sestina. That's still my white whale, actually, is I want to write that poem, and it needs to be a sestina, and I haven't gotten a good version of it yet. Um, but effectively, I never thought of poetry being something that I did, because it wasn't. Like, I didn't write the angsty poems in high school. I didn't write poetry for like a class in college or anything. This one I consider my first poem with those air quotes because it's the one that launched me into poetry is a thing I do now. I wrote this poem, and then a couple of months later, I was like, huh, I have this idea about women being erased from history. Boom. Oh, I do this now? I write poems now? Okay. So this is where it began. This poem was published in Alphanumeric, which, if anybody's not familiar with these, they actually podcast their poems in addition to providing them in print. So they look for things that will be interesting to the ear. And so I sold them a sonnet called The Great Undoing. The wolf will not stand still. You must give chase. The fire in his flesh will make him run. Catch him, bind him, belly fur unlace, and from his bloody gut release the sun. Rope down the 7 extras from the sky, and recondense the seas they burnt away. In muddy graves, command once more to lie the wakeful corpses, there to ever stay. Knit up the rents that in the earth were torn, the pale horse chivy back into his stall, the molten metal river cool to ore, the tentacles beneath the waves recall. Though time's long coiling twist we cannot yet uncurl, mistakes amend, undo the end, remake the world. So the backstory behind this one is that I have a file where I keep a list of all of my possible short story ideas so that I won't forget them. And periodically I will go through and be like, oh yeah, that one. Oh wait, I think I want to write this one now. And some of them have been on that list for years. This was one of them. It was just the idea of what if you like undo the apocalypse by reversing events of the apocalypse, like it starts with the Fenris wolf eating the sun in the Ragnarok myth. Um, and in October of 2021, I was looking through that list and my gaze fell upon this, and I thought, I don't think that one is ever going anywhere because it's not a story in the way that we look for from fiction, right? It's just here, idea, boom. And tiny little voice in the back of my head goes, what if poem? And I was like, what? I don't write poetry, but well, it's not going to turn into a story. What do I stand to lose? So I sat down and, brainstormed or looked up a bunch of like different myths. So this actually comes from myths around the world of things like there's 7 extra suns in the sky that are boiling away the seas and so forth. The tentacles are a bit more Cthulian. But yeah, that was the moment at which I went, oh, is this what a poem idea might look like? Which means that it actually mirrors how I learned to write short stories because I started out as a natural novelist. Like that was what I was like programmed for at the outset. And I couldn't write short stories for years. I would try every so often, they'd be terrible. Until one day I went, oh, that's what a short story sized idea looks like. Now that I know what to look for, I think I can do these. And I started writing short fiction. So similar thing with poetry of, oh, right, if I have just a neat idea, that can be enough for a poem. It can be enough to just say, here's my idea in pretty language, the end. You don't need characters and plot and all the rest of it. Um, Now, some of you with a good ear for meter may have heard that this it's mostly a Shakespearean sonnet. It expands to an Alexandrine conclusion, which is to say it's a hexameter rather than pentameter. It's an extra foot long. That was a mistake. That was me just oopsing too long of a line. And then when somebody pointed it out to me, I looked at it and went, well, I can't rephrase it in a way that I like as well as what I have, so I'm going to claim that was deliberate aesthetic choice instead. And fairly recently, I discovered that an Alexandrine final line or final couplet is a thing that other venerable poets have done. So clearly, I am following in their footsteps, and that was not just a mistake. Definitely not. My next poem comes from Worlds of Possibility. It was published in June of 2024. And because I apparently have a penchant for titling things in Latin, there will be one more instance of this before we're done. This one is called Draco Urbis, or Dragon of the City. Gleaming with late day light, layered scales of windshields along the looping highway coils. Awake. Dragons. With bones of steel and concrete flesh, rousing from urban layers, take to the skies and roar. That one is a mirror syncane. This is another instance of that whole, I've got an idea, but it keeps not growing into a story. I have a couple of short stories that are effectively born of the idea. Well, actually, they were inspired by a Cirque du Soleil act, but the idea that it gave me was to write about the urban environment with the same kind of personification that the Greeks with like the nymphs and so on applied to the natural environment. It started with the notion of like, what if buildings had the equivalent of dryads, that there's a spirit of the building. And this one was from me being stuck, I think, in Texas, like Dallas traffic, and looking at some highway off ramp or whatever with the cars just at a halt along it, and the light gleaming off of all the windshields, and I thought it looks like a dragon's like coil. So highway dragons. No plot, none whatsoever, just highway dragons, the end. Okay. And so again, that was me going, oh, this idea that's never gone anywhere, maybe it should be a poem instead. And I actually now have two mirror syncanes written about kind of dragons in the modern world. And so clearly I need at least a third one so that I can call them a set. If I have three, then it's a set. So I'm still waiting for that third mirror syncane about modern urban dragons to propose itself to me. And yes, that one was in Dwarf Stars. I see that there in the chat. Yes, which I was very proud of. That I'm like, oh, look, I'm doing this poetry thing, and like it's even been reprinted. This is all very new. Um, the next one I sold actually to a literary magazine, the Rialto Books Review, who just about a week ago bought two more for me that are going to be out next month. This is the only literary magazine I have yet sold to successfully. They're clearly not adverse to spec, as you'll see, this is very much a speculative poem. And what makes me like Rialto, apart from the fact it's a print journal, so I actually get a physical thing from it, but they want form. They like form poetry, they want form poetry, and I love form poetry. It's not everything that I write, but I do enjoy playing around with it and looking for that like gestalt between the form supporting the idea of the poem and those things kind of feeding each other. That's my favorite game to play with it. So yes, the fact that there's a market out there that says we specifically don't want free verse, we want form, I'm like, God bless you, because you'll actually buy those things from me. So this one is called Among the Briars. He'll never make it past the tangling thorns. His bones will bleach, untidy in their heap. And once you're dead, forgotten, no one mourns. They say that none's won through, the teller warns. But we're not hurdles made for men to leap. He'll never make it past the stabbing thorns. The risk of death a true steel hero scorns. Mere caution is for peasant-hearted sheep. But once you're dead, forgotten, no one mourns. The next prince tries, his flesh in tatters torn. He stumbles on, grit strives his feet to keep. He never makes it past the vicious thorns. So crying, dying, of their valor shorn, each man is by the cursed briars reaped. And once you're dead, forgotten, no one mourns. Our vows to wake the princess all forsworn, our ghosts penumbra to her endless sleep. We never made it past the blood-stained thorns, and now we're dead, forgotten. No one mourns. Yes, that is, as you probably heard, a villanelle, which felt to me like it was very well suited for this idea. This is another one where it was going to be a short story, and in fact, I have 2,500 words of this story, which petered out. I could not, like, I spent years, I wrote a little bit at the beginning, came back to it years later, wrote some more, and it just never wanted to conclude as a story. So I thought, all right, let's try it. And when I was looking through forums, I saw something about the villanelle talking about how the refrain lines make it well suited to obsession. And I thought, yes, because this is a story about one prince after another trying to get to Sleeping Beauty's castle and dying, and their ghosts are now haunting the Briars. It's, it's people being stupid and doing the same thing over and over again. Villanelle, perfect for this. So that's really, this was the one of the first poems that I wrote. And I guess The Great Undoing being a sonnet, I'd written form before that, but this was my first villanelle. And it really cemented for me that feeling of, yeah, yeah, if you can find the right form for what you're trying to say, they can end up feeding each other in a way that I think free verse wouldn't have done for this particular topic. All right. I think this is the last of the Latin titles I have in here, Axis Mundi, which those of you who know your folklore may know that that means the world tree. This is the concept of something that connects the heavens to the mortal realm to the underworld. It's the axis on which those things turn. And this was originally published in Eye to the Telescope in April of 2025. Holding the heavens above the forest canopy, Seba, Bodhi, Fusang, or Ash, emerald elder of the world, the tree grows through earth and into cool shadows of the underworld, cradling lost spirits in its lace, its roots the foundation upon which everything stands. This is one I did consider not including here because it is more meant to be seen on the page than heard out loud. But when I realized I was going to be reading effectively my entire body of work, I thought, no, let's do it. We're going to do all of them. This is, I kind of invented the inverse mirror fib. So the fib is a syllable counting form that starts off very small and the lines get longer following the Fibonacci sequence. I start with a long line, they get shorter, and then it mirrors and spreads out again, which means that this doubles as almost a concrete poem, that it's like the branches of the tree, the trunk, and then the roots. But those, one syllable lines in the middle are a little awkward to read out loud. I don't think it's the best one for reading, but having committed to we're going to read everything, then I'm going to read everything. It's really only 10 poems, it's not a lot. The other one that I thought about not including for a different reason, I apologize to anyone who knows their Scottish Gaelic. I studied Irish Gaelic instead, so my pronunciation of some of the words in here may not be quite right. Apologies ahead of time. I think of this one as being kind of sort of an Onyx Court piece. That's one of the series of novels I've written. They are historical fantasies taking place in London at different points throughout the centuries. And so this has to do with history. It has to do with fairies. So I think of it as Onyx Court adjacent, even though it doesn't reference anything specific to the canon of that series. This was published in Augur in September 2024, and it is called To the Angels Alone. They hear her prayers, the fairies of her land. The bodaks and boobries and busy brownies, the kushi and katshi and bavanshi, the yililu in the green, and the gildirum so small. The red cap stands ready to rend her enemies in twain, the tro to drag them under the hill. The kelpies and dunnies and achushka fight for the right to drown her foes. But the Banni washes her gown in the stream, and the Koenig laments in the night, because her words are not for their ears. On her knees she pleads, Mary, captive Queen of Scots, for angels and ministers of grace to defend her, and they do not answer. Yes, Mary Queen of Scots was held prisoner in England for a number of years due to the incredibly complicated politics that were going on then. I touch on that a little bit with Midnight Never Come. That's the Onyx Court book that takes place during the Elizabethan period. But yeah, I had the notion of looking at things from Mary's side of it and thinking, what if the fairies were ready to help her, but she was too devout a Christian to ever ask them for it? Uh, My next piece here is also inspired by folklore, which you may have noticed there's been a running thread, not in every poem that I've read so far, but fairly common. As you heard in my bio, I was a folklorist in college and in graduate school, so this is a frequent source of inspiration from me. But in this case, the inspiration is more kind of a thing that folklore will do rather than any specific piece of it. It is also from Worlds of Possibility in June 2025. Story sits in places. A giant bound in stone, that distant peak. An ever-sleeping woman curves these hills. The tears of parted lovers feed this creek. From every place, remembered history spills, a landscape of our heroes, griefs, and kills. When we set out across these weathered stones, we walk atop our ancient forebears' bones. Title of that one, Story Sits in Places, is an allusion to a fairly famous work of folklore by Keith Basso called Wisdom Sits in Places. It is a study of the Western Apache, a particular band thereof, and the ways in which the landscape around where they live, countless places around them are linked to specific stories from history, from folklore, and so on, and the ways in which they use that landscape in their behavior and in conversation to communicate with each other. It's a really fascinating book if you're interested in that kind of thing. I won't try to replicate or to summarize it all, but he talks about, for example, one person might say to another one, like, I see that you have returned from place name, where that place name is associated with a story of somebody doing something like really stupid and foolish, and that's their way of basically saying, I see you've decided to stop being an idiot. I'm so glad. That these things get worked into conversation. By seeing those places in the landscape, they get reminded of stuff which they then kind of take into themselves and use to reflect on their behavior. Um, and it's a thing that you actually find in lore around the world of the landscape having these stories kind of inscribed upon it. And it's why displacing people from their land can be so traumatic, because now that people have literally been ripped away from the landscape of history around them. So I wanted to write a poem that would touch on that idea of living in a landscape that has this kind of story written into it. I I'm going to break with the folkloric one a little bit on this next poem, pivoting to modern, but you will see in a moment that it still riffs on one of the other things that I love playing with, which is language. I am a language nerd. I'm not fluent in anything other than English, but I have studied a bunch of different languages. This one was published in Merganser magazine in August of 2025, and it is called Hallucination. They feed it so much shit. Walkthroughs for games on obsolete consoles, fiction filched without permission or pay, advertising copy, racist screeds, political speeches, the internet's weeds. The terms it learns hurt. Negging, swatting, incels and trolls, Pizzagate, Gamergate, anti-vax, TERFs, Make America Great Again, the 14 words of hate. But from the rank corpus arises a word, mudita, joy in others' joy, and one word generates more. Panaxia, the belief that all lives have value. Helpcraft, technology that serves people, not profits. Aura martis, refideliment, abolition, fair pay for artists, restoration of trust, the abolition of war. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Inchoate craving for better words, a better world, than the one its makers made it eat. I sort of hesitated with this poem because I I hate the way that we ascribe personhood to what's being passed off as AI right now. It doesn't have a brain. It does not think. It does not feel. There is no person there. It is an illusion. Um, so this poem does hinge on the notion that, oh, this, AI is going to hallucinate better words than the ones it's been fed, and that's, feeding into this idea. So I was a little iffy on the poem. But mudita is a real word from Sanskrit, I believe. And I had fun coining different ones of like, okay, let me take Latin and Greek roots and Germanic roots and so on and smush them together to make new words. I was tried to pronounce it clearly enough that you could hear abolition, B-E-L-L. Bellum is Latin for war. So abolition is the abolition of war. Uh, yeah, languages, they're fun. They're a fun toy. But having then gone a little bit grim there, I'm going to give you something more peaceful. And also the longest poem that I have had published to date, I think. It's possible that one that came out in January is a little bit longer, but it's the longest in this set. This was published in Haven Spec in March of last year, and it is Hermit of the Crossroads. The hermit kneels inside his cell and prays. Here two roads meet, and at their crossing stands a sacred guard for all the kingdom's ways. This cell, 4 paces square, is all his lands. 4 windows glimpse the freedom of the sky. 4 prisoning doors he closed with his own hands. For water and for food, he must rely on charity from those who walk the road. In advent of his blessing, they supply not only those few alms that he is owed, but conversation, company, and news of incidents beyond his small abode. For moments, minutes, hours, they amuse the ancient hermit. Then away they trail, returning to the world that he eschews. To guardian the roads, so goes his tale, and few there are who ever comprehend how his unmoving presence can avail against all storms and perils that would rend the kingdom into many scattered parts. But in his sacred solitude thus penned, the hermit knows his sacrifice imparts protection, love, a sheltering, gentle spell that far surpasses all the warlike arts. Until one quiet night an unseen bell rings out, and north or west a door swings wide, as if from out this humble citadel the hermit, bent-backed, tottering, might stride. His end is near. He rises up to wait, and see who from the chosen way will ride. A traveler, fated, finds the hermit's gate has loosed its hold. His own road brings him here. He kneels to let the hermit consecrate him with a touch. Then, without any tear, the hermit breathes his last. One final act. Within the ground the traveler lays his pier, and under open sky and earth compact, the newcomer the holy body sets. He lays one hand upon the old and cracked wood of the door, and, leaving his regrets outside, he closes it. And there he stays. Whoever he once was, the world forgets. The hermit kneels inside his cell and prays, a sacred guard for all the kingdom's ways. That one is terza rima, with a little bit of a sort of terzanellish twist at the end there, bringing back the opening lines. This was one where instead of me finding it on my list of unwritten stories, I had the notion, there's a type of hermit called an anchorite or an anchoress if it's a woman. This is a thing that you saw in like the late medieval period. People would actually be walled into a cell to stay there for the rest of their lives. Which, like, on the one hand is sort of horrifying and on the other hand kind of beautiful to me. I actually have like interestingly mixed feelings about that, which I came up with this notion of a hermit who somehow protects the roads by going nowhere. And when I had that idea, I did have that moment of, do I want to try to build this up into a short story? Or do I want to do it as a poem? And I decided poem because I liked the way that that would give me the opportunity to put the focus kind of on the language and on presenting the idea rather than trying to make something like, I mean, something does happen. It is obviously narrative. Um, but it felt more more poem to me. So that's the way that I did it. And I think I prefer this version to a short story that I might have made out of it. One more sip of water. So the last poem, naturally the one that I felt I should close with here, is the one that won the Hugo. That is still weird to me that I have a Hugo Award for poetry. Didn't I just start doing this like last week? uh, Literally, to the month, I won the Hugo for this 2 years after my first poem was published, like right there in the same month anniversary, getting the award. Um, because I have repeated this in a number of interviews and I mentioned it in the acceptance speech you may have already heard, but getting it on the record one more time. This was inspired by a book by Robert Bringhurst called A Story as Sharp as a Knife, which is about traditional Haida storytelling. And it was specifically inspired by a narrative in there narrated by a Haida man called Kilhoggins. That's my best attempt at the pronunciation. I apologize for the errors I'm sure are in it. Um, in that story, basically a raiding party of young men hear some women making an odd cry of delight, and the story basically implies that that cry is stolen as part of their raid. And so I think of this poem as being about like the loss of indigenous languages and the ways in which those get kind of stolen in a sense by colonialism. But one of the things that I like and that I think has contributed to how this poem was received is that other people have read it as being about dementia or aphasia or anything that feels like it is stealing language from you. So I think that flexibility has added to its impact for people, that it doesn't just have to be about one thing, it might be about several. So yes, this was published in Strange Horizons in September of 2024, A War of Words. Last week, I had a word for it. That feeling when something goes well, really well, and you're warm and bright inside. There's a word, but it's gone, stolen, seized in the raid. The others have it now, in the town across the bay. Not the feeling, but yes, the feeling and the word. They came again this week with those things in their hands. Metal, sharp, you hurt people with them. We have them too, but not the word, not anymore. The sounds and the scents taken back across the bay, a trophy of their triumph. Today it was the water, the big water that divides us. We're losing more and more battles, more words, all gone across the water. I can't name anymore because it belongs to them now. What are they? I had a word from them this morning. I know it. I don't know it. I only know they'll come back, and I won't know what they've taken. Just one thing after another, until we have no words left. There you go. That is everything I've published that's not still in exclusivity right now.
You are amazing. You're just, that was fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And wow, I the poem you conclude with, the poem that won, yes, it evokes all of those things, but it speaks to even that particular. There's an organization whose name escapes me, but it still exists, that I believe it's in New York City, and it oversees, catalogs, monitors the loss of languages. And maybe you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of it
I
either,
can't
but I know what
remember
you mean.
the name either, but that I was so affirmed that we as humanity, at least created a something to attend to the loss. Doesn't stop the loss because the loss, as your poem suggests, comes from war, comes from appropriation, comes from aggression. So, like I said, comes from the loss of a struggle, that there's a struggle and someone loses, and so the thing is lost. But I'm gratified that there were others other than me and you who organized to say, um, let us do what we can to preserve, to archive, to note, and not let it pass unremarked, which
And there
takes
are
it as
revival efforts that in some cases are working. So yeah.
no, please speak to that.
I I mean, it's kind of a spectrum of I think the most successful revival was actually of Hebrew, which for, a long time was not really a language that people spoke in their daily life.
Mm,
But like Ireland and Wales, I know have pushed a lot for the preservation and revival of Irish Gaelic and of Welsh.
absolutely.
Um, I uh,
I
I
think
know
they've
that like
done, I think they've succeeded. I hear that young people are learning it.
we are learning it. I know for at least a decent number of Irish people, it'd say, "Yeah, I studied that in school." Kind of the way that Americans would be like, "Yeah, I took 2 years of French. Man, I don't really speak French." But you do get things like, Irish music. There's a strong trend of people still singing in Irish. There are still regions in Ireland where Irish Gaelic is like a normal, regular use of language. Um, and smaller efforts that haven't necessarily had the same scale of success because they're operating in different contexts. But where I
Mm.
live in the Bay Area, there are Ohlone language classes offered to they're not offered to the general public, otherwise I'd be really tempted to go take it, but they're not aimed at white people like me, basically, and that's fine. Um, but yeah, looking for ways to kind of keep that strong within the community to encourage younger people. And there's been the shift of you have less of the older generation saying, "Oh, I don't want my children speaking this language that is considered backwards." Like there's more pride around it now than there was, say, 50 years ago. So I see
Because,
some comments from Miguel about Scots
yeah.
there. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know. I wasn't sure what the situation was with Scottish Gaelic in Scotland, which is why I didn't mention that one. But I'm glad to know that that's apparently going strong.
What reminds me of that is uh, because I like to watch BritBox. There was a series when one of the detective series, and there were whole hunks of dialogue that were in Gaelic, and it
Mhm.
was not specifically for that audience. It was that challenge and that pushing, and I was like, "Yay for you, folks! You know,
Yeah.
uh, speak that tongue. Let us
Well,
hear."
I've been enjoying the TV series Dark Winds, which is based on Tony
Me too.
Hillerman's.
Yes,
Yeah, and I'm told that in the first season the Navajo pronunciation is not that great, but they've
they
been
said they
working on
worked
getting better.
on it. Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yes.
yes. Yep, yep. Oh,
I love that that show is being like, yeah, no, we're going to
Dark
use the language.
Winds. Yes. So your work is so resonant for me in so many ways. Um, and I love that you answered many of the questions I would have asked you anyway. Like, when did you begin? How did you start? Um, and even, but maybe you'll speak more about how brilliantly, how succinctly you've put that I have an idea, and when the idea tells you whether it's a poem or a story or a novel, and how poetry has expanded your set of possibilities for your ideas. Please tell us more about that.
The boundaries aren't distinct, right? I actually have a couple of things that I think in both cases I originally wrote them as flash fiction. One of them I ended up selling the flash and retiring the poem version of it.
Mm.
The other one I still have both of them making the rounds, and whichever one sells first wins, I guess. Um, But, especially when you get down to that level of flash fiction, because flash can do what poetry does, of kind of like if you do it well enough, you can get away with just idea the end
It can
and
be,
not,
it can be even prose poetry sometimes.
yes, which is, that's such a liminal, inherently liminal category
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that I will admit, like, I don't feel like I've gotten a grip on prose poetry yet because I feel like most of the examples I've seen tend to fall into one of two camps for me. One of them is that was a lovely piece of flash fiction and I enjoyed it. It was very beautifully written. And the other one is that was word salad and I'm not sure what the heck it was about. Like, I've seen both of those. And I think it speaks to the fact, I'm going to digress a little bit from your question, but
Mm-hmm. Go.
I I need to track down where I like who originated this idea because I saw it at one point when I was reading up on poetry and went, yes, I agree with that. The notion that poetry is a quality and the opposite of prose isn't poetry. The opposite of prose is verse. And poetry is something that verse can have, and it is something that like prose can have. Because like you mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, I was
Mhm.
actually researching that at one point for a novel and talking with somebody who specializes in Mesopotamian history and such.
Wow.
And I said, I was like, so we talk about it as a poem. Like, what are the poetic, like, what's the poetic structure here? Like, it doesn't look like there's line breaks or anything when I look at the cuneiform tablets. And the guy said,
Oh.
basically, it isn't verse, it is poetically written. And
Mm.
we don't know enough about Sumerian poetry and such to really be able to break down like what were maybe like are there structuring things in there that this was how poetry was done. And it just kind of comes down to those categories are blurrier. It's not a distinct here's one, here's the other, and not really much middle ground. So yeah, then this gets us to the prose poetry. That like entire category made no sense to me until I
Mm.
started thinking of poetry as a quality. And I'm
Mm.
like, oh, prose poetry is going to be very poetically written prose. Gotcha. Okay, now it makes sense to me. Um, and so yeah, like that's where you're seeing kind of that fuzzy boundary. And so you can get things that are crossing over. And also I'll say between short stories and novels, I at one point I realized there was a novel trilogy idea that I was never going to write because my
Mm.
career's gone in other directions. And I was like, that's fine, because like there's a lot of stuff in it that I wouldn't really want to do. But man, that core idea at the heart of it, I still really kind of love. And then I read some Borges, where he'll often just kind of like give you
Ooh.
a summary of the novel that he's not going to bother writing. And I went, yes. So I turned a novel trilogy into a 2,400 word story. So these categories are fuzzy. um, but yeah, when I write something with poetry, I feel like it frees me up, even when I'm doing something that does have some narrative to it, which I do sometimes. But my attention can be on like studying the idea very closely and just looking at the beauty in a broad sense, because sometimes it's horror, but horror can be
Mhm.
beautiful in its own way. Uh, and really just reveling in the aesthetics of it for their own sake without feeling like it needs to deliver more, like it needs to have a plot. And, I say
I
this
was
as
just
somebody
that
who
that's the word I
started out
wanted
as a
you to
novelist. I
say.
like plot.
Right. I wanted That's the word I wanted you to say was plot. The
Yeah,
plot
yeah,
the plottedness or plotlessness.
yeah. Like, I mean, even with Hermit of the Crossroads, obviously you could write out, here are the events that happen,
Mhm.
all, like couple stanzas worth of them. Mostly it's just sort of describing, here's the situation, and then a guy comes and takes his place. And, we have these conversations in fiction around the role of conflict, right? And do you need conflict? And I actually wrote an article for SIFWA at one point about reframing the notion of conflict as effectively not necessarily A versus B, but some kind of imbalance that
Mm.
makes it so the status cannot stay status quo, right?
Hmm.
That something changes. It might be healing, it might be discovery, but there's something that puts it off balance and gives it momentum into something else. Um,
I like that notion
so
a lot.
yeah, it helped for me to frame certain kinds of stories that I'm like, I do feel like there's a plot here, but it's not conflict in the way that we, reduce it to a lot of the
Right.
time.
And it's less hierarchical. So
Yeah, yeah.
I like things that resist hierarchy and yet compel. Miguel has a wonderful comment. So he says it's fun to incorporate poems and songs in prose to enhance the storytelling, which was going to be my question to Marie, that now that she's writing poetry, is she going to be including more poems in her stories?
Um, More I don't know. Because so it's sort of funny to me just because I did that before I started writing poetry. I did have I've got
Oh.
one short story where I basically a Japanese man who's been alive for over 1,000 years for reasons goes to the moon for reasons. This is Speak to the Moon, which was published in FNSF,
I like
and
that.
I knew because it's based on the story of Kaguya Hime. It's a riff on sort of what happened with the end of that story. Um, but I knew that when it came to the end of the story, there was going to need to be some poetry, and it was a little jarring to only just
Mm,
drop it in there. I got this feedback from a reader, and I think like there were two poems that get exchanged there that are actual Heian era poetry that a friend of mine had translated, and then one haiku that I put in of my own at the end. But readers were like, I had a friend read it over and give me feedback. And he basically said, like, it's jarring to have that show up at the end of the story. So I seeded a few more poems in earlier.
mm.
Um, but, I did that. And there's a comment about, like, JAXA's the Japanese Space Agency, and some, comment about, like, ah, yes, and he was the best poet at JAXA, which wasn't saying a lot. That here's a character who's writing poetry, but I'm not claiming in the story that the poetry is immortal and wonderful, right? It's just this guy writes poetry.
Right.
Um, and same thing in one of my novels, Turning Darkness into Light. There's a free verse poem in there that one of the characters writes. And again, it's not presented with any claim to, and this is deathless poetry. It's just this character wrote a poem, which takes the pressure off. Like, I feel now if I put poetry in something, which I probably will at some point, but I'm gonna feel more pressure now that like it really needs to be good poetry. So
Uh-oh. That's yes, that's self-inflicted though.
yeah,
You could always use the disclaimer you've used in the past, which
yeah,
is if
yeah.
I'm doing it in the character's voice, how good can it? I can't make it too good now. You know, if that character is not a poet,
Yeah, as long as I don't claim that the character
air
is like the
quote.
most famous
Right,
poet of their
right,
land.
right.
Yeah,
Oh,
an
oh,
improved poetry art.
improve, but you saw what he said.
Yeah, okay, so your character can have an improved poetry art. I mentioned doing this for games as well. I ran a tabletop role-playing game at one point using Legend of
Oh,
the Five Rings, which is very inspired by historical Japan. And so I said to my players at the outset, I was like, poetry is important to the society here. That's why, like, there is a skill that
mm,
you can take for your character writes poetry. And my players hopped on board with this in a way that I did not expect. And so I think the first poem I wrote for that game, that one of the female player characters, they were at some event or another, and I was like, oh, there's going to be this like minor clan samurai who writes her the worst poem I can manage. Like,
oh,
how can I write the most
a bad.
appallingly no, that is not how you haiku. Ow. So I wrote the worst poem I could, which I think helped, break the ice a little bit. Um, by the time that campaign was done, so I speak some Japanese. I'm not great at it. My
Mm,
sister is more fluent. She's actually lived in Japan several times. And oh, I'll come back to the dog roll as a +1 weapon in just a moment. I have a friend's story about that. But my sister's more fluent in Japanese than I am. And so when it came time for her to write poems as her character, she was actually writing them in Japanese first and then
oh,
translating them.
that
And
is,
so we wound up with bilingual editions of some of the most important poems in the game.
oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Do
it
you
was it
share
was a little
those at all? I don't
um
know Japanese, but I'm av anime, and I've tried to sing some of the songs in Japanese from my favorite anime, so I would love to, read
give
whatever
me
you
half a
have.
second here. I'm like, yeah, this is one where it is so much in context. Basically there's a whole story here with one of the characters finally declaring his love for somebody else. Um and thanks to my sister, like some of these may know with the are these publishable, some of them probably would be, and maybe I should try to shop them around more. They're not spec, so I can't send them to the markets that are most
Uh,
sort of congenial to me, the lit markets. I sub my stuff to them. They generally don't give me the time of day. But
Never stop
I
trying, please.
So you guys may be aware that, you'll hear haiku, and I tend to write a lot of tanka more than haiku.
Mm.
They don't work the same in English as in Japanese
Mhm.
because Japanese can play games with the language, like using homophones and such, where, punning is a very low form of humor in English, but in Japanese, it doesn't have that lowbrow and funny connotation to it. It's part of how you kind of turn a haiku or
Wordplay.
something into a TARDIS. It's bigger
Mhm.
on the inside, right?
Mhm.
So this poem actually has
I
like an
like
entire
that you
paragraph.
called it a TARDIS. Oh my God, that's such a quotable quote. How you turned it into a TARDIS. Oh my God, Marie, you're
Poem
so
actually has an
wonderful.
entire paragraph of explication about what's going on in it in the Japanese version, but I will read the Japanese, I will read the English. Uh,
Thank
so
you.
with this is the first time I've tried to perform Japanese in a reading. Okay, here we go. 月のよう、実は見ていたと聞いたが、桃の甘露も種も否めず。So, in the kind of poetized English of it rather than literal translation, I was always taught that truth changes like the moon,
Mm.
but I can't deny the stone at the peach's heart or its sweetness on my lips.
Ooh.
That was the declaration of love of this one character who
Oh
had basically
yeah.
been like a dishonest
I
liar his
no, I
entire life.
I felt that was hot. I felt that.
Well, and it gets hotter when you get into things like I'm not going to read the whole unpacking here, but peaches are a symbol for male homosexual love in kind of East Asian imagery. Um, and the word that normally for sweetness you would say amami, but kando literally translates to sweet dew, which, yes, that
Ooh.
is every bit as suggestive as you think it
Ooh.
is. Like, it's got things like that packed in there.
That's so fresh. I love it. Oh my gosh.
So anyway, yeah, we had bilingual poems, and I did have fun going from like the worst doggerel haiku I could come up with. Oh, the doggerel is a +1 weapon.
Mm.
Um, I know somebody who is playing a bard in a D&D game where the bard is kind of like an angsty teenager,
Mm.
and she is attacking the enemy with like the worst doggerel that she can write. And when she rolls badly on her attack roll, she's going to read actual Emily Dickinson poems because she accidentally read them good poetry, and so it's not harming them.
Oh my gosh.
Which I think is just brilliant.
That is so I love it. I'm here for it. I'm so here for it. Um, you talked about not having done a Sistina. I wanted to know, have you tried any pantoums since you like villanelles?
I have a Pantoum that I really want somebody to buy, and it's running into the number one, it's form poetry, which fewer markets are interested in that, and number two,
But
it's humor.
pantoums are I love pantoums. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
I've mentioned this one in passing a couple of times because I like to trot it out as an example of poetry doesn't just have to be about the deep, meaningful things. It can also be a customer complaint during a zombie apocalypse where the woman speaking has apparently not noticed that there's a zombie apocalypse underway, and she's very upset that her husband's corpse has walked out of what was supposed to be a theft-proof vault. So why is he just able to like walk right out that door? And she's gonna leave a 1-star review for this company. Uh,
That's
but yeah,
yes. Oh joy.
yeah, so I did like that. That was one that I originally tried to write as a villanelle, and the repetition was too much. There wasn't enough room in the poem to develop the plot that was there, and it kept going back to the same lines. Whereas a pantoum with like the
The
cycling of it's always
weaving,
another,
yes, and
yeah.
moving, yes. That's why I
It
thought you would like that form. Yes.
Yeah, it was weirdly well suited to a customer service complaint because like people keep on harping on a point that they've already said and going back to it, and I'm like, yes, this
You've got
actually
a
works. Well,
request. Send it
yeah.
to Spectoverse, Miguel says. So you've got a request
No
for the
kidding.
poem. Oh my, it's
Uh,
7:59. Oh no.
all
It's
right.
okay. All right. I'll contain myself because it's been fabulous. Marie, we could talk for hours. And, maybe we need to find a way, you and I, Miguel, some other poets, maybe, just sit around and chat sometime because it's so delightful and enjoyable. Um, I would not think you'd only been doing this for 2 years, but I can't even say that because you're a writer who's been writing. You've just turned your attention to this approach and format and way of being. And I'm glad that your array of the ways that you are include poetry. We've all been better for it. I adore your concerns with language, with folklore. It's been grand. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone for coming. Next week in the series is Mary Terzillo, and I want to prevail upon you all to spread peace, know joy, breathe deeply through your nose. Thank you. Good night.